On August 12, 2015, one of the worst industrial accidents in recent history rocked the port city of Tianjin, China, located 75 miles southeast of Beijing. Explosions at a container storage station in the port of Tianjin killed over 170 citizens and first responders, and injured over 700 more in the surrounding residential area. Subsequent investigations found that the fire and the explosions were caused by the illegal storage of thousands of tons of hazardous chemicals, including nitrates, flammable materials, and toxic compounds contained at the station. The explosions triggered a series of secondary explosions and fires that burned for days. Firefighters and medical first responders were unaware of the dangerous chemicals involved in the blasts. As a result, water from fire hoses reacted with volatile chemicals during the initial response, which many feared released toxic compounds into the air and water system. After the initial explosions, local and national news coverage of the event and the emergency response were censored by the Chinese government. The government's media arm purged internet and social media posts, which included the words Tianjin and explosion, and removed websites which they accused of publishing false information. There were also conflicting reports of evacuation orders, and people on the ground did not know whether or not to comply with unaffirmed orders. Ultimately, after significant time had passed, citizens in the area were ordered to evacuate, although some refused to leave their damaged homes. With the impending threats of large-scale pollution and potential health risks, medical personnel and citizens were anxious for reliable public health information on which to base their actions in the days, weeks, and months following the disaster. As the world continues to rapidly industrialize, increases in industry, population, and trade all contribute to the likelihood of industrial accidents and disasters. Political corruption, lack of accountability, and unregulated industries are all factors that can affect the seriousness of industrial disasters and the effectiveness of industrial disaster response. Ideally, regulations, health systems, and responder capacity grow in tandem with rapid development in order to prevent and to respond adequately to such events. In China, experts have seen a shift in the nature of industrial disasters after 2005. Prior to 2005, industrial disasters occurred primarily in heavy industrial areas. Poor and vulnerable populations working in hazardous occupations, like mining, were the most susceptible to this type of disaster. After 2005, China saw a shift in the location and nature of industrial disasters. With factors like increased urbanization, industrial activity, and population growth, recent disasters tend to affect urbanized and populated areas inhabited by the middle class. Examples include the explosion in Changchun City, Shandong Province, and Kunshan City, all of which resulted in significant injury and economic loss. This shift also affects different demographics. Now, rather than industrial workers, it is more often first responders and city residents who are injured or killed during industrial accidents.
Tianjin explosion in China in 2015 is a classical example of the latest epidemiological pattern of technological disaster in China. Of course, it's a very important situation that caught attention of the global community. Since 2005 to the current years, what we actually found is that most accidents no longer is associated with heavy industries or not heavy industry. It's most of the major incident that caused mortality, morbidity happens in urban settings. We have a few major explosions in 2013 that was publicly documented globally. It's all related to some kind of chemical explosion of illegal practice. And the problem is, of course, because it happens in the urban setting, residential area, no one would have expected such accident will have occurred. So the general committee are not prepared. They don't even know that it may happen to them. Second of all, it's also the responders. For the past few decades, when the pattern is different, it also usually happens to the workers of the mines, workers of the industries. But nowadays, it actually happens to the responders. So like the Tianjin incident, what happened was the fireman who was trying to put out the fire because first their training, the equipment actually it doesn't give them the capacity to respond to such an explosion. And because of how they organize the fire department or industry in China, people are actually not prepared. So as a result, we have a different patterns of people who are injured, from industrial workers now to responders. We have civil society who are not prepared because they never would have thought where they live is actually where the risk may lie. And furthermore, it's also challenges. How do you communicate the post-disaster risk? Because when it comes to industrial accidents, most of the time there would be impact that may be quite long-term, even if it's not for physical injury, the mental health impact.
Government control of media during emergencies or a public health crisis is not unique to the Tianjin case. Control of information during a disaster allows the government to manage what, if any, information reaches the public beyond state-run media sources like television or radio. However, in the era of smartphones and increasing internet penetration in many regions, primary sources of information like photo, video, and personal testimonies are difficult to control. The aim of government control of information or media after a disaster may be to reduce false information or public panic. This type of control, or even direct censorship, is often criticized as a damage control tactic for the ruling body. However, in times of disaster, restriction of information flow often leads to an information vacuum that actually results in a larger amount of speculative information, which is then given more credibility by the lack of reliable sources. It is also possible that censorship helps to target specific sensationalized information or false claims during critical moments in a disaster. For example, one reporter stated that after the Tianjin explosion, local reports suggesting up to 70,000 affected, 1 kilometer radius from blast site totally obliterated. While this claim could be easily disproven, it did have the potential to add to public panic early in the response. However, in the case of Tianjin, these types of exaggerations or gaps in public knowledge were not filled with viable public health information about the disaster's implications, chemicals released in an urban area which posed a clear and immediate threat to the local population and responders. Senior managers at the Ruhai logistics warehouse in the port of Tianjin had circumvented regulation and reporting requirements to store large quantities of dangerous chemicals in a limited storage yard surrounded by a residential neighborhood. In an effort to maximize use of space, large shipping containers were stacked high in layers with inadequate space between stacks. The management of the storage yard had also failed to properly train their staff on safety procedures for handling containers containing hazardous and combustible chemicals. On August 12, 2015, at 10:51 p.m., after rough handling by ground crews, a cargo container filled with nitrocellulose, a highly combustible material, caught fire. Upon seeing the fire, it took only 1 minute before police were called by warehouse staff. Within 4 minutes, firefighting crews were inside the storage yard. However, due to the close stacking of containers, firefighters were unable to reach the source of the fire in their fire engines, and instead focused their efforts on spraying down adjacent containers to protect them from the growing heat. As firefighters waited on cranes to unblock their access to the fire, they sprayed cargo containers with fire retardants that could cause violent chemical reactions due to their unknown contents. It took a total of 38 minutes before the flames ignited the first of 2 explosions. Highly explosive chemicals like ammonium nitrate have strict rules associated with when, where, and how they should be stored. In the case of the port of Tianjin, regulations prohibited storage of any ammonium nitrate within the port, but a total of 800 tons of ammonium nitrate were intentionally stored, mixed with other hazardous chemicals, including refined naphthalene, sodium sulfide, and furfural alcohol. In fact, The storage facility contained more than 3,000 tons of hazardous chemicals, many of which were in falsely labeled containers distributed in a clear violation of safety protocol.
Holy
You get that?
videoing it. What the fuck? Yeah, it's a guess. Whoa! Oh! What the? Holy no! What? Oh shit! No, baby! No!
Nice. Are we dangerous here?
Yeah, we're dangerous. Oh my God! Oh dear!
Are you filming?
Yes, I'm filming.
Wow! Wow! I think we are dangerous.
The shockwaves and reverberations from the explosion were massive, registering as high as a 2.9 level earthquake on the Richter scale and damaging areas up to 13.3 kilometers away from the blast site. Buildings within 150 meters of the epicenter were destroyed, leaving behind only their concrete frames. At the forefront of the explosion, more than 80 firefighters were killed in the line of duty. Their 30 firefighting vehicles, along with a total of 12,428 commodity cars, were damaged or destroyed in the blast, along with over 300 buildings and 7,533 cargo containers. In total, the blast damaged 17,000 apartments and affected 30,000 people, with a resulting death toll of over 170 and over 700 injured. The explosions wreaked havoc in the residential community. Buildings and livelihoods were destroyed. Citizens and first responders dealt with the immediate consequences of injuries, deaths, and mental trauma caused by the chemical explosion. However, while the community was struggling with these factors, the question about environmental safety created outspoken frustration within the population. Despite pointing to the Ruhai Logistics Company as the guilty party, the government supplied the people with little information about the chemicals released into the water and air systems, and little information about the short, medium, and long-term effects of the explosions on the residential area and surrounding environment. Many of the chemicals released during the explosions had toxic properties. One of the most lethal was sodium cyanide. The chemicals were named, but little was known about exposure levels or remnants in the air, water, and soil. Sodium cyanide and other chemicals posed an immediate threat to public health within Tianjin, with threats ranging from asphyxiation to neurotoxicity and death.
My name is Dr. Timothy Erickson. I'm an emergency physician, and I've been in training for emergency medicine specifically and working in the emergency department for 30 years. I also have a background in medical toxicology. Following my emergency medicine residency training, I did a fellowship in medical toxicology. That was a 2-year fellowship, and I've been in medical toxicology for 25 years. Sodium cyanide is additive to many chemicals. It's worldwide. Cyanide itself comes in many forms. It's very lethal to the human body and to animals. And the reason is, particularly in vapor form, as you inhale it, it hits at a cellular level, and it causes cellular hypoxia, which means lack of oxygen to the cells. If you inhale it, oftentimes people will collapse. They'll have a fainting episode. We also call it syncope. They may have seizures, and then a rapid fatality or death. And when these chemicals superheat and there's a spontaneous combustion and auto ignition of this chemical, then you have a plume, you have a vapor, and then people can get this through the air and inhale it, or it can get on their skin, so it's dermally or skin absorbed. And it can also then run into the environment. If the sodium cyanide is still in the environment, those living around that area still may be vulnerable to it, not just with it volatilizing or becoming a gas, but maybe ingesting it because it's in their groundwater.
In a baseline public health response, information flow and communication are paramount. Information flow, or lack thereof, affects three major areas of a response after a disaster. These major areas are the first responders, the affected community, the environment and public health situation in the region.
In terms of response, it did very reasonably well. Within 4 hours after the explosion, they managed to mount up about 1,000 people, rushed to the site, and within 72 hours, more than 60 experts was on the site to help with the response. Having said that, it also shows that, the response side, for capacity which government can mount up the response, is actually very efficient. But there's still other dimensions which the governments face major challenge, is the civil society. Because it's not only about the response, it's about how community is protecting themselves. Because for this particular incident and chemical explosion, we talk about environmental risks and hazards. When it comes to public protection, one of the very important concepts that people should reflect on is what is critical information. If you talk about the number of people who died, number of people who got injured, who got into the hospital, I think by the 21st century in China, those numbers are quite accurate because of how it was double-checked by civil society with information and so on and so forth. But that leads to the next step. Aside from the death, the hospitalization, the morbidity, what may be important information to be shared with civil society in order to track middle to long-term impact? I have to say, around the world, I don't think many communities, even in developed countries, has agreed or have a consensus what is the best way to track those impacts. And I have to say, especially in places like China, when the development stages varies across the country, it becomes a problem.
First responders need information about the nature of the disaster. A lack of briefing and training before the disaster and a lack of information during the disaster puts first responders' lives at risk. Poorly informed first responders also have the potential to put the entire community at risk if they do not deal with hazards effectively.
So the fact that you have a populated area, you have volatile chemicals way in excess of what was allowed, you have canisters and containers that are stacked, and they're supposed to be individual with good space between them, because if you get a fire or an explosion in one, it's going to quickly jump to the next. And these were stacked. One of the tragic parts of this particular case is they had no idea what the chemicals were. So first responders coming to these industrial disasters need to know what's in there. Because some of the blame that was put on the firefighters were, okay, you had combustible potassium. You have sodium, which people know as, well, it's table salt. What's the problem adding water to that? But when it's in an elemental form, sodium and water can actually ignite. They didn't know this. They were just trying to put out a fire.
Additionally, the community needs information before, during, and after the disaster. Community awareness of hazards are important factors that traverse multiple levels of response. A variety of government officials and agencies, health systems, and communities need to coordinate in the interest of public health and safety before, during, and after an emergency response.
If there is sodium cyanide, as well as other combustible compounds, be it ammonium nitrate or potassium nitrate, the sulfides, those are all dangerous chemicals. And if I was made aware as an expert in toxicology that there were 680 tons of sodium cyanide in a small area surrounded by a large population, my recommendation would be to evacuate the general vicinity make sure we had a good handle on how much was there. Is there really 680 tons? If there had been a fire or a combustion event, how much of that was volatilized and then burned off? But I'd want to know what the content was, where it was, is it still contained? So there may be 680 tons, but 90% of that is contained in storage vessels that are environmentally sound.
It is important to build emergency response capacity, but this must go hand in hand with information dissemination about immediate threats to community health in the event of an emergency. Accurate information and protocols based on practice and trust can reduce panic, injury, or exposure in the critical time frame after an event.
After the explosion, after the fire, it's still safe to live in that city, okay? But if I lived in the immediate vicinity, if my business was there, my home, my place of religion, work environment, I would be more concerned. And what I'd be concerned about is I have not seen reports documenting air quality, soil quality, drinking water quality. I've seen reports saying they're fine, there's no pollutants, there's no toxins, there's no health risks, there's no aftermath flow into pipes, into the water system. But as a toxicologist and as an environmentalist, I've not seen reports actually documenting those levels. Now, if they exist, I'm happy to review them in the defense of those environmentalists and government agencies that did them. If they exist, I applaud them. I'd like to see them.
For the Tianjin case, what we see is that government was trying their best to ensure the response happened. But in terms of managing public expectation, there's still a lot of things to learn about. Not only is the right information to be shared and so that community can trust the information, the other dimension is where do they disseminate the information? Because of all the historical reasons, government may have its channel to talk about information. But if you look at how civil society in China is accessing information, they may not. China's government's websites may not be the first layer of information they try to extract information, but it's actually dangerous in both sides because it's not clear who tells the truth, and it's even worse is because when it comes to a situation that affects health, decision or information, accurate information they can provide can potentially really save a lot of harm.
Public health is vitally important in these situations because a lot of the news, BBC, CNN is going to tune in the explosion, the fire, the death toll. And that's appropriate, it needs to be reported. And there were years before media coverage where these types of disasters would happen and no one would really know about it. And they'd be held down by the government, by the owners. But now with media coverage, we know right away. And that is important. And it's important to know what happened immediately. Are we containing this disaster? Are we containing the fire? Are we containing the potential toxins and the health risks in the immediate? But what public health does, they come out after the CNN cameras and the BBC cameras are off. They look at the people, they look at the health of the people, the environment, and look at long-term impact. And they just don't make rash statements. They use epidemiologic data, they use monitoring, they use parameters or measurements to say, okay, we thought this would be a huge health risk, but it turned out it wasn't. That's important to publish and study. Or we may say, yes, it's still in the environment, and this particular chemical is a carcinogen, meaning a cancer-promoting agent, and people need to be warned, and people need to be evacuated, and people need to be compensated for that evacuation.
For the civil society, the way they access information could be problematic too, because there is official channel, of course, government, civil society may try to get information. But from the civil society point of view, it's a matter of public awareness. I mean, how do they access information when crises happen? And whether they have the basic knowledge base in order to facilitate decision making in such a health risk situation. I think this is also a problem facing with the 21st century globally, because many of the times you can find information on the internet, but how do you ascertain this information was right? And how do you ascertain, even if so much information, what decisions to be made? So of course, globally it's problematic. In China, that's also one of the major problems because of how people lived. We live very closely together. It's not like they can run away from other settings because of how movements in China communities are. I mean, people are kind of stuck in the community. And as a result, I mean, they are actually facing major challenges to deal with that. And even for government point of view, in order to ensure the panic doesn't spark off and people will be running around, they have to see the best way to feed in the right information and hopefully be able to gain the trust of the civil society about the information they are sharing. So this is one of those very interesting dimensions that we're seeing more and more, because nowadays with internet, people have access to information. Governments trying their best to share the information, but whether civil society decide or make a decision of trusting the information is one of the basic issues.
There is a difference between acute panic and chronic panic. Acute panic can be a good thing. It gets you out of the dangerous environment. Chronic panic can be crippling, where you can't get on with your life.
In terms of the basic, like water, sanitation, food, safety in the air, that whether my kids may be affected, it could be very problematic. And to be honest, I don't think it's only about China. It's also about many parts of the world. When environmental risk happens, there are cases where people don't find the right information to make the decisions.
If I lived in a community, say in a city, and there was an industrial explosion and a fire, I'd want to know, first of all, is my family okay? Is the school system for my kids okay? Is it safe to go back? So in many environments, I'll pick Chernobyl as an example where I've done work at, people that lived in the Chernobyl area did not want to evacuate. That was their home. For generations, they wanted to return. It was the government that said it's not environmentally safe and we're not so sure what's going on. You have to evacuate. And it's only 25, 30 years later are people now returning to that area. So it takes many years to really get an idea what the environmental impact of something is like this. And before I wanted to know what was in those barrels, what was in the canisters, the vessels, I'd want to know, is it just safe? Not just safe for my long-term health, cancer risk, neurologic or brain deficits, but is it going to hurt me, or kill my children in the immediate near future? Even if I'm in the lay public and don't have a health background, I think humans in that area have the right to know what's in their neighborhood, what's in their community, what's being stored there, and then they make the decision whether they want to live there or not. Now, in reality, in many parts of the world, people who live in certain villages, and we see a lot of urbanization because that's where the jobs are. People don't have the option to migrate, nor do they want to. They have to be in that area, and oftentimes it's generations deep, so they want to stay. These people in vulnerable populations may not be able to move and not have the means to move. So if that's the case, I'd want to know this was safe for my family. And the other thing, of course, you'd want to know, is it going to explode again?
After the outbreak of the fire, the response to the Tianjin disaster began. The timeline of the response can be broken into 3 phases: alarm and first response, affected community response, and environmental and public health response. Over time, the scope of the phase increases with the growing effect of the disaster on the community. It starts with the initial alarm and ends with its lasting consequences. Within each phase, a variety of actors, state, firefighters, medical, or media, interact, and their decisions directly or indirectly influence public health in Tianjin. With a focus on public health, each of these phases contain critical points in which the overall response to the disaster could have been altered, contained, or avoided altogether to produce a better public health outcome. The events in Tianjin posed a variety of hazards at multiple points for different members of the public. These hazards are instances where individual and public health were in immediate, intermediate, or long-term danger. Public health officials may prioritize certain threats above others, especially when key information may not be available. In conjunction with these threats, there was also a threat to information flow, or communication, between all levels of the response. Information flow is the pathway for communications about hazards, threats, and risk. The pathway stretches from the highest levels of decision makers down to the community and individual levels and back to the decision makers. Information flow is critical to public health decision making and can mean the difference between life or death on the ground. Two major areas of study related to information dissemination before, during, and after a disaster are crisis communication and risk communication. Though they seem similar in name, crisis communication and risk communication are quite different in both their application and their intent. Crisis communication is most often associated with public relations and aimed at improving efforts to strategically manage and frame public perceptions of an event so that harm is reduced for organizations, individuals, and stakeholders. Risk communication, on the other hand, is most often associated with the identification of risks to public health. Risk communication involves the dissemination of information about acute emergencies, environmental hazards, such as chemical and toxic contaminants, disease outbreaks, or behaviors that increase health risks to the public. The intent of risk communication is to share timely and reliable public messages regarding health risks and environmental hazards that empower citizens to make decisions to minimize harm. Historically, risk or disaster communication may have been characterized as the one-way dissemination of emergency messages about the size or scope of a risk or hazard to an affected population, but modern theorists now conceptualize this type of communication as a politicized field of forces with many senders and possibly conflicting messages competing for the attention of receivers. Well-placed messages have the ability to empower citizens and responders by giving information or instructions that increase the self-efficacy of people facing risks for themselves, family members, or neighbors. Societal understanding of risks is increased by providing information and stimulating active participation in the public debate. Disaster management can be seen as a co-production, requiring not only the activities by responders, but also the cooperation of citizens in rescue activities and assistance for those in their communities who cannot be reached through specific media.
Tianjin case is a wake-up call. These are time bombs waiting to happen all over the industrial world, and with the globalization and free market and the imports and exports, what are in those ships? What are in those diesel trucks? What are in those trains? Who knows? Is it what they say it is? A public health worker can come in and say, this is how we can look at this, what went right, what went wrong, and how can we prevent it from ever happening again? And if it does, can we contain, can we evacuate, can we save life and clean up the area in a quick fashion so there's little aftermath?
We need some dimensions in the society to allow people at least have an alternative voice to understand. I mean, the distance of the reality and what was being told, what they were being told. And if there's a gap, not only is the government the trust issue, I mean, that needs to be strengthened, also we need that sector in the society to support information flow. And I just wish that there are more academics around the world. I mean, not only in China, they're willing to at least work at least independently, to at least be able to talk about these issues as well. So I think for China nowadays, they try to open up information by allowing public access to regular statistics. But the challenge they're also facing is how much trust can they gain from the general public about the statistics relevance and the usefulness. And that is also an issue which academic comes into play. Because, of course, government has its own machinery to talk about information, but civil society as academic settings, which we do research, we're supposed to be independent. We are there to reflect the real situation and hope to be able to share a point of view, to triangulate information too. At this moment in China, I wish there are more academics that are willing to work on this kind of issues in order to provide another platform so that at least civil society has an option to understand problems and understand what may be the appropriate health risk or health response that they can mount up together.
As a public health expert with a focus on disaster communications, you have been invited to offer your critical assessment of the short and long-term Tianjin response. In an after-action debrief and analysis session hosted by local and national government officials, your job is to identify and share areas for improvement at each phase of the response. Your focus should be on determining at which points public health outcomes could have been improved through specific individuals or groups receiving or sharing critical information during the response. Keep in mind, the Tianjin explosion and its aftermath directly affected many different groups, including first responders, local citizens, hospitals and healthcare workers, workers in industry, local and national government officials and agencies, and local, national, and international media. The disaster and response also had a direct impact on the public's confidence about information disclosure, credibility, and their personal safety. It is your job to try and determine how the local and national government could best manage key information to improve public health outcomes for these groups while controlling an unprecedented industrial disaster.